Virginia, 1861. There was a grace to it and a tranquility. Something in this soil nurtured Virginia's sons, gave them the gifts of gallantry and courage. Something in this soil made man hope against hope, that war between brothers would not come. And even as the shadows of war gathered, something in this soil made men try for peace with dignity. It was Virginia's legislature which called in January of 1861 for a national peace convention in Washington. Virginians led this last great effort to avoid a tragic war. The convention chairman, former President John Tyler of Virginia. Striving with him, Virginians whose forefathers had sailed to the New World in search of opportunity and founded the first permanent English-speaking settlement in America. They carried with them an invisible cargo, the seeds of all that would make America, America. In Williamsburg, for more than a century beneath the British flag, the vision grew. Here, the dream of self-government took shape and substance. Here in a church in Richmond, resistance found its voice. Give me liberty or give me death. In the building of a nation, it was Virginia's destiny to lead. Virginia's sons were ready. George Washington, father of our country. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. James Madison, architect of the Constitution. George Mason, champion of the Bill of Rights. Out of Virginia's living heritage came Washington and 6 other of our first 12 presidents. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Harrison, Tyler, Taylor. This was the something in the soil that made Virginia call the Peace Convention. But the tide of history was flowing too rapidly to be stemmed. On the very day the convention met in Washington, another convention gathered in Montgomery, Alabama to bind together the first 7 states of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis was elected president. But still Virginia strove for peace. April 12, 1861. Fort Sumter. From this time and place, there could be no turning back. From Washington, the call came for 75,000 volunteers, Virginia to supply her share. Beyond this, to permit troops to cross her soil to invade her sister southern states. For Virginia, the turning point had come. As leader of the South, she would stand with the Confederacy. Richmond would be the capital of a new nation. Virginia stood at the threshold of sacrifice and war. The hope for peace was gone. Between the capital at Richmond in that gentle spring of 1861 and the capital at Washington, almost symbolically still incomplete, there lay slightly more than 100 miles. For 4 long years, Virginia would be the most hotly contested ground of war. 5 great impacts made upon the Confederacy would be on Virginia's soil. The first Manassas drive, where the opening guns at Bull Run announced war's grim reality. The Peninsula Campaign, the great amphibious operation aimed at Richmond. The bitter thrust at Fredericksburg. The drive turned back at Chancellorsville. The stubbornly resisted hammer blows that carried men in blue from the wilderness to Petersburg and the gates of Richmond. From Virginia's soil, the 2 invasions of the North would be launched. The first to Sharpsburg, Maryland, where Antietam Creek ran red with heroes' blood. Last to a quiet Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. All this was still to come that fateful spring of 1861. No hill or valley or tranquil meadow was yet a battleground, yet within men's souls, the battle of conflicting loyalties was already joined. As much as any man, Robert E. Lee faced the sternest test. At Arlington, overlooking Washington, Lee faced his crisis of decision. These were his words. I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children. There was a gaiety to it, a color and romance in July of 1861 as amateur soldiers prepared to meet for the first time in Virginia. Many who marched to Manassas thought the war would be short and bloodless, an exercise in gallantry. Union General Irvin McDowell had 35,000 troops. Confederate General Beauregard, 21,000. Later joined by General Joe Johnston with 9,000 more. At Bull Run they met, two green armies in the opening test. A Union victory seemed assured. Then Confederate General B rallied uncertain troops with a cry, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." In that moment, General Thomas Jonathan Jackson of Virginia became Stonewall Jackson, a name for history. Confederate lines held, and possible defeat was turned to overwhelming victory. The first Union thrust upon Virginia's soil had been repelled. McDowell's withdrawal became utter rout, then panic. But to both North and South, Manassas brought a grim reality. North and South, they felt it. War was not all flags and fun and marching songs and epaulets. Suddenly, in a single day, they knew it would be a tough war, a grim war, a test of each man's will to stand with courage for his beliefs. A war which would be more than a dashing, gallant exercise demanded men of planning. Men like General George B. McClellan, chosen by Lincoln after Manassas to head the Union Army, to build and shape an army for a new thrust at Richmond. McClellan's plan was invasion by sea, based on the Union Navy's superiority. Then on March 8, 1862, off Hampton Roads, Virginia, the South aimed a blow at that superiority. A strange, ingenious ironclad, the Virginia, also known as the Merrimac, burned the Congress, sank the Cumberland, ran the Minnesota aground. The next day, the Union answer, the Monitor, appeared. The battle was a draw, both ironclads retiring like wounded gladiators. But the true casualties were all the wood-hulled ships of all the navies of the world. Now the giant armies could come face to face. After almost a year of preparation and build-up, McClellan's Army of the Potomac landed at Fortress Monroe, which had remained in Union hands. McClellan's plan, to move up the peninsula toward Richmond and to be supplied by Union ships sailing up the York and James Rivers. Inch by inch, the Confederate sons resisted. Yorktown, Williamsburg, 7 Pines. Here, among the 11,000 casualties, was General Joe Johnston. Wounded, he was replaced by General Robert E. Lee. Far to the west, in the misty Shenandoah, Stonewall Jackson, mercurial, unpredictable Stonewall Jackson and his foot cavalry, immobilized Union troops McClellan thought he needed desperately. They thundered and thrust their way through the valley with a quick series of brilliant victories. The Shenandoah was Virginia's natural invasion route to Washington, and in the federal capital there was apprehension. Without his reinforcements, McClellan crept cautiously toward Richmond. Less cautious was Lee's audacious, dashing General Jeb Stuart and his cavalry. In June of 1862, Stuart and his troopers, 1,200 strong, daringly rode completely around McClellan's army. The young cavalry general brought Lee the intelligence he needed to take the offensive, and his army of Northern Virginia, 7 miles from Richmond, blunted the Union thrust, pushed the Army of the Potomac into retreat in the battles of the 7 days, which raged from Mechanicsville to Malvern Hill, and in a rising tide of victory late that summer, hammered another Union army into a major defeat at 2nd Manassas. By the end of the summer, 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia was poised for its first invasion of the North. Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. To these riverbanks, the tide of Southern hope for victory flowed in early autumn of 1862. To reach this place, the sons of the Confederacy had marched and fought and died for 3 long months, had whipped an army at the gates of Richmond, and a second Union army that came to its relief. Under the driving, restless leadership of Lee and Jackson, the Army of Northern Virginia thrust northward. Then, at Frederick, Maryland, the hand of chance changed history. Wrapped around 3 cigars, a copy of Lee's orders was dropped by a careless officer and fell into Union hands. A well-informed McClellan attacked with 70,000 men. At Antietam Creek, the battle lines were drawn. September 17th, 1862, a day in which, at a rustic bridge, in a quiet cornfield, a pleasant churchyard, more than 23,000 men gave up their lives. The bloodiest day of battle in all the war, it is said. Lee's invading army had been turned back, but with consummate skill, the Army of Northern Virginia was held intact. The fall and early winter of 1862 were relatively quiet in Virginia. At Fredericksburg, the Rappahannock lay between exhausted armies. In camps on either side, soldiers waited, filling the hours with the little occupations men find to hold off the knowledge of danger still to come. December 9th, a Confederate soldier wrote, "I don't think Burnside will attempt to cross the river this winter." December 11th, Burnside launched a doomed attack on Fredericksburg across the bitter Rappahannock. December 13th, all day long, brave Union troops attacked. You've heard the names: the Sunken Road, the Stone Wall, Mary's Heights. They spelled death. Confederate sheets of fire raked the blue columns. The Army of the Potomac would not reach Richmond through Fredericksburg. In May of 1863, the Army of the Potomac, under its new commander, General Joe Hooker, tried once more for Richmond. He established his army at the crossroads of Chancellorsville. Outnumbered almost 2 to 1, Lee, in a bold move, split his army, sending Jackson on a 14-mile march that surprised and smashed the Union Army. It was a day of victory for the South, and yet the Army of Northern Virginia would never again be the same. It was at Chancellorsville, the dusk at Chancellorsville, that Stonewall Jackson was wounded fatally, unknowingly, by his own men. And men shall tell their children, though all other memories fade, that they fought with Stonewall Jackson and the old Stonewall Brigade. In the middle of May of 1863, General Robert E. Lee conferred at the White House in Richmond with President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet. They faced the reality that despite victories in Virginia, the Confederacy was under unrelenting pressure. Blockaded at sea, in danger of being split in two by Grant's drive down, the Confederacy's hopes rested on the chance that the Army of Northern Virginia could win a decisive victory in the North. Early in June, Lee headed north, the three corps of his army commanded by General James Longstreet, General A.P. Hill, and General Richard S. Ewell. Between Lee's Confederate Army and Hooker's Union Army, rival cavalry sparred and skirmished. Station, Jeb Stuart's troopers fought in the largest cavalry engagement ever waged on American soil. Continuing northward, moving up the valley, Ewell's corps took Winchester. By the end of June, Lee's army was in the vicinity of a quiet Pennsylvania market town. July 1st, 1863, the Union Army under General Meade was driven back to Cemetery Ridge. July 2nd, Confederate attempts to capture the dominant positions of Cemetery Ridge were repulsed. July 3rd, pickets charged. Across a mile of open ground they marched, 15,000 men. Flags flying, drums beating, spirits high. 15,000 men. This was the climactic moment. At Gettysburg, they had failed, but not in greatness. The Confederate dream of victory in the North was gone. From these green fields, the sons of the Confederacy, those who had survived, withdrew. On the day the Army of Northern Virginia turned home, unpursued, unvanquished, Vicksburg, the last stronghold on the Mississippi, fell to General U.S. Grant. The Confederacy was cut in two. Its resources limited, the blockade growing tighter, the Confederacy growing smaller, Confederate forces in Virginia faced a future that would test its will and fortitude. Spring 1864, the Wilderness, the last great drive by Union armies toward Richmond. This time there was a difference. General Ulysses S. Grant, a worthy adversary for the brilliant Robert E. Lee. With overwhelming numbers, he launched a three-way assault. Under Grant himself, the main attack force crossed the Rapidan. Lee canceled the Union advantage of strength by forcing Grant to fight in the tangled confusion of the Wilderness. And there, despite his losses, Grant chose to continue the invasion, driving to Spotsylvania Courthouse, a quiet crossroads of a town. May 12, 1864. 12,000 men fell in the struggle for 1 square mile of ground. This was the Bloody Angle. That same day, Jeb Stuart died, age 31, dead of a mortal wound received the day before in a cavalry clash at Yellow Tavern. At the same moment, Union troops threatened the Shenandoah and its vital food supply. In desperation, young cadets of the Virginia Military Institute marched into battle at New Market. 247 boys under fire for the first time. Their charge turned the tide and held the Shenandoah. All through May, in move and counter-move, the armies inched southeastward. Move and counter-move that led Grant to his costly error at Cold Harbor. In 15 minutes, 7,000 Union men were lost. After 10 days at Cold Harbor, Grant tried a new stratagem. The Union Army crossed the James River and marched to Petersburg, rail center and key to Richmond. Here for 10 bitter months, Lee's genius would hold off the Union forces. Early in the siege, Pennsylvania coal miners wormed a tunnel 511 feet long under a salient in the Confederate line, then blew it up to rush troops through the gap. Into the crater, a 500-yard gap in Lee's lines, Union troops swarmed without leadership or effective plan. Above their heads, Confederate lines reformed. Union men gave their lives in the fighting. And the routine of trench warfare resumed, but with an added threat: the dictator. An 8.5-ton mortar that could hurl a 300-pound shell some 2 miles. But besieged Petersburg withstood the assault, and the Army of Northern Virginia held firm, checking Grant's army all through 1864. By the end of 1864, Union General Sherman had marched to the coast and captured Savannah, dismembering the Confederacy. Now it was a war of attrition. At Petersburg, the Army of Northern Virginia was pinned, defending Richmond. For all his skill and ingenuity, Lee and his veteran troops were being overtaken by the mathematics of warfare. Supplies grew scarce. Shoes, when available, had wooden soles. Both soldier and civilian tightened their belts. And in the long trenches before Petersburg, an exhausted army, a hungry army, was being stretched to the breaking point. Grant's tactic in early 1865 was to extend his lines to the west around Petersburg. With each move, the defenders' ranks were thinned. On March 31st, Sheridan's troops attacked an outpost southwest of the beleaguered city. And at Five Forks the next day, Grant drove through and broke the back of Confederate resistance. 24 hours later, he penetrated the defenses of Petersburg. The 10-month siege was over. The road to Richmond was open. And there, President Jefferson Davis received a message. General Lee can hold his position no longer. With his cabinet, Davis left Richmond for a temporary capital at Danville. To prevent supplies falling into Union hands, Richmond's warehouses were put to the torch. The fire raged out of control, gutting half the city. On April 3rd, Union troops entered burning Richmond. Meanwhile, Lee pressed westward. Somehow, somewhere, a supply train of food had been misrouted, and Lee's plans for a last stand were nullified. At Sailor's Creek, 8,000 men surrendered. The last battle of the war in Virginia. Lee moved westward, only to find Union infantry preparing for a final massive attack. It was a place called Appomattox. April 9th, 1865, Palm Sunday. After 4 long years, the war in Virginia was over. These were the words of Lee's last general order. With an unceasing admiration of your constancy and devotion, I bid you all an affectionate farewell. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed. He was not bitter in defeat. In that September, a month in which he became president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee, he wrote, "I believe it to be the duty of everyone to unite in the restoration of the country." And Robert E. Lee also said, "Forget your local animosities and make your sons Americans." There was a greatness in him and a generosity of spirit, and his name would stand with all the names linking Virginia to history. Manassas, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Winchester and the Wilderness, Port Republic and Petersburg. From the Shenandoah to the coast, the tide of history rolled, and in the deeps and shallows of that tide, the sons of soil and cities, north and south, stood for all the world to see what men could do in defending their beliefs. Virginia now, today. Something in her soil reaches now, as then, to man's sense of destiny. Man's hopes still echo in the capital at Richmond. The memories of man's striving fill a White House of another time. It is a century since the guns were silenced, a century in which the trials and triumphs of a time of sacrifice and glory have come to be a common heritage for all Americans. Across the years, we search the meaning of the sacrifice of gallant men, both North and South. And all that is Virginia now, today, responds. The wind blows fair off Hampton Roads, where Monitor faced Merrimack. The winds blow fair across the ramparts of Fortress Monroe. The winds of history rustle the rigging of 1,000 ships in the Mariners' Museum at Newport News. From the Tidewater westward across the Old Dominion, the haunting names and places speak of a time now gone, Yet somehow in the names and places there is a meaning fresh and still alive. It hovers gently over earthworks. It rests cupped in a shallow crater at a place called Petersburg. Take what road you will, you walk in history. There is a meaning for our time in the names and places, a meaning you feel at Fredericksburg. You sense it at the stone bridge across Bull Run, and where Jackson stood at Manassas. More than beauty roams the valley of the Shenandoah. You sense it in the names which are a catalog of courage. Newmarket and Cross Keys, Front Royal and Cedar Creek. Appomattox. Across the span of 10 decades, a nation reaches back to history, and all that is Virginia now, today, responds. At Lexington, perhaps above all, the meaning for our time is clear. Here, where young cadets of VMI set forth to give their last measure of devotion, where Stonewall Jackson's gallantry and courage are etched eternally upon the southern sky, and where Lee rests in endless nobility of spirit. The legacy of a time gone by is clear. It is a common heritage for all America. The bravery of those who met the challenge of that time. This is the something in Virginia's soil which reaches out across a century. The will and valor of brave men north and south who shaped a nation on this hallowed ground in the defense of their beliefs.